Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our second of 3 webinars leading up to the conference called Opening the Archives of the Impossible, which will be launched on March 3rd. So I'm really pleased to be with Professor Priscilla Wald of Duke University today. I'm going to introduce Priscilla, and then we're going to just engage in a free conversation around why the paranormal really is or should be central to so many of our academic disciplines and how it helps us rethink our categories and rethink our histories. First, the official stuff, which Priscilla has asked me to keep short, so I will. Professor Wald teaches and writes about US literature, particularly of the late 18th to mid 20th centuries. She is interested in the intersections of science, medicine, science fiction, and environmental studies, all themes, by the way, with very strong paranormal currents. She is the author of 2 distinguished books. The first in 1995 is Constituting Americans, Cultural Anxiety and Narrative Form. The second in 2008 was prescient. It's entitled Contagious, Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative. Priscilla is presently writing a book called Being After Genocide on the conceptions of the human that have emerged from new developments in science and technology after World War II. She is especially interested here in tracking what she calls a new mythistory, particularly through the genre of science fiction, something we saw last week with our first webinar guest, John Philip Santos. Now, the personal stuff. I fondly remember my 2 most recent trips to Duke, both to the Paranormal Working Group that Priscilla helps lead, and I hope we can talk about. The first was the last day of January of 2014 for a conference called Mutants, Mystics, and Aliens Outsiders, the Theology of the Paranormal and Myth in Popular Culture. The second was in October of 2016 for a lecture on my close friend and colleague, Elizabeth Crone, and her NDE after being struck by lightning. What so struck me, pardon the phrase, about both visits was the intense cross-disciplinary interest in paranormal currents that was so alive at Duke. I'm sure it's still alive. I mean, there were literary critics, scholars of religion, historians, poets, and medical professionals all present. It was obviously a multidisciplinary crowd and a very intense one. Priscilla, welcome. Welcome to our webinar. Welcome, I guess, to Rice University in some kind of digital form. It's good seeing you again.
You too, Jeff. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's start with the Paranormal Working Group, and maybe you can tell us a bit about it and its history and what you've been up to and why you think the paranormal might be essentially the future of knowledge in the academy.
Yeah, or certainly a future. I think, so the group started, there is a cluster of people interested who are in the English department. And we really see the paranormal as something that has inspired artists, writers, painters, sculptors for centuries. And we really wanted to understand that. And we put out just feelers, and there just were a lot of people at the university that were really interested in it. And I also have a particular interest, obviously you mentioned, in science. And fundamentally for me, how could a question be more interesting to a researcher, an educator, whatever, than what we don't understand? I mean, what are we doing if we're not trying to understand what we don't understand? And that particularly the strange, the weird, what's going on there, and whether it is an inspiration to artists to imagine. There's something disorienting about the questions that don't make sense about our world, or to take maybe another extreme. I don't really see it that way, but another discipline or set of disciplines in the sciences. What are you studying but the things in the world that you don't yet know about, that don't make a lot of sense? And so for me, the paranormal is the cluster of things that raise questions no matter where we are, for any discipline. The things that get us past, get us past the discipline, you could say, because what is a discipline but a collection, a border, a boundary, right? So what's going to push at that, but what we can't explain.
Yeah, there's something disciplining about the disciplines, right?
Totally.
They essentially, beat us up and force us to think in a certain way. And these paranormal phenomena are always sort of appearing in the interstices or the in-between that don't fit in anywhere.
I remember once, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, we were talking before the show, as it were, and I was saying, look, your message is essentially a banner for this conference. I mean, this is what we're trying to do with the conference, is argue that there is not only a place for the paranormal in the academy, it should actually be at the core of our questioning and of our category formation. We should be really thinking about this across the board.
Well, and that, I agree. When we define the paranormal as the things we can't yet explain.
Yeah.
So, if someone says to me, well, why are you going to put little, blue men from Mars at the center of our inquiry? It's like, that's not what I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about the things that happen that are weird, that don't fit any of our categories, and that therefore we kind of have a tendency to push aside to Bruce Lincoln, who was a participant in that first panel, in fact, who gave the title to that first panel, which was originally supposed to be a panel on myth, and every single invited person was in fact writing on the paranormal, which is what Bruce noticed. Bruce is an amazing, fabulous scholar of theology and religion at the University of Chicago. And he was talking about that he was the one who noticed that everybody was talking about the paranormal, and he gave the title to that panel. So we shifted focus because of Bruce. And one of the things Bruce has he said to me once in an email, which I just thought was so profound, was that we don't make the things that we're not supposed to look into. We don't really make that taboo. We make it in a scary way. We make it silly. The things we're not supposed to be looking at because they're really going to challenge something, we dismiss by making it like childish or silly or something like that. And, if I say to some people in a university, I'm studying the paranormal, it's like, oh, something I don't need to take seriously. Something, that's not Kant, but actually it is Kant, if you ask me, right? And I think I think that was so profound, what Bruce said there.
Well, that whole panel was profound. I mean,
you were great on that panel.
Oh, thank you.
You also said something I continue to repeat.
Yeah. Well, Nathaniel Mackey was there, and Victoria Nelson and Bruce Lincoln.
Yep,
yeah.
All stars.
Yeah, that was the panel, right? And
yes.
I remember, I was trained at the University of Chicago. I was not trained by Bruce. Bruce came in kind of as I was leaving. So I didn't really get to study much with Bruce, but I was so struck, as I've told you, by his paper, which was essentially about ghosts and hauntings in Vietnam, and how scholars do an injustice, a fantastic injustice, by reading these as texts or as discourses or as kind of Derridian, deconstructions, when in fact, these people are getting, the crap scared out of them, and they're being haunted by ghosts. And I was just so, that's not something I was trained to say, by the way.
Well, and I want to do a shout out to the person who got Bruce there, his daughter, Martha Lincoln, who's an anthropologist, brilliant anthropologist.
Who of course is working in Vietnam, or was working.
That was, yes, on public health. And she came across all these people who were literally haunted. And she said to her father, I've been working on contagion, but there's this other contagion that, that is, I'm seeing all over the place. And he went over with her and investigated. And, kudos to both of them for having open minds about what they were seeing and experiencing and taking people seriously, as you say.
Well, that's what I felt. I mean, I told Bruce that afterwards. But I mean, the whole panel is like that. And so let me back up. I mean,
Can I talk about what you said on that panel?
I don't remember what I said, but
You
please.
said something also really important. And somebody asked, I think it was in response to a question, I'm not sure. I think somebody had asked you, well, why isn't this studied more? Maybe you just were saying why it wasn't studied more. And you said the problem is that the thing that these paranormal experiences people have so often happen around trauma. And so you can't ethically produce it in a laboratory. So there's no way really empirically, or at least you have to really get creative to study in any empirical way. And my husband, Joe Donahue, who's a brilliant poet, was sitting in the back of the room, and all around him were people in white coats who had come in from the hospital. We were right near the hospital. And when you said that, my husband said they all started nodding.
Yeah.
And I thought, again, like spot on. So,
Well, yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I say that a lot because I think it's true.
Mhm.
And the people I've worked with who have been extreme experiencers all have been traumatized, and I mean, that's what a near-death experience by definition is. You almost die, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's physically traumatic. And this is when these things spike. And then, so when people say, oh, well, you can't produce this in a laboratory, I'm like, of course you can't. You can't kill people.
Right.
You can't do that ethically.
Or you can't have their spouse killed. I mean, some of your stories about, the woman, and I've heard this kind of story a lot, who it wakes up in the middle of the night because her husband's speaking to her, but in fact, he's been killed at that exact moment in a traffic accident, 30 miles away. Like you cannot reproduce that.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I joke, he's usually apologizing to his wife because that's what husbands do, is they always apologize.
I'll let mine know.
They're always wrong. Yeah. Okay. I want to back up a bit and ask you about that word paranormal, because I get criticized a lot for using it as well. And but then when people tell me what we should be talking about, I'm like, but that's what they meant when they coined the term. I mean, that's exactly what it means.
Right.
But so it's a matter of kind of taking back the category and recognizing that it was actually academics and scientists who coined these words.
Right.
And then they kind of got lost, and we're trying to, essentially grab them back. But what I want to ask you is whether there's something in the water at Duke. I mean, come on, Duke University has a history before Priscilla Wald of looking at the paranormal.
A very much more distinguished one, the Rayzor. Yeah. Who was, I believe, wasn't he a biologist?
He was a botanist.
A botanist, which makes perfect sense to me, because I think there's something so paranormal about plants.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that, and we're beginning to see that. And, another thing I would highly recommend is Richard Powers' novel, The Overstory, which is amazing. And I think has a paranormal, trees are speaking throughout this. But he talks about a woman, and I'm blanking on her name, but it's modeled on a real scientist. And actually several people have done this work. There's also a German forester who's done this, who have documented the ways in which plants actually communicate to each other. I'm going to put this in anthropomorphic terms because I don't know how else to say it, which is what's so interesting, right? We don't have the language for it, but that if a tree is dying and needs more water, the roots of other trees will start funneling water to it. And what do we call that? We can attribute human motives to that. I don't think that's fair to do, but I also don't think it's fair to assume that isn't. We don't know is the point. And that's science. And it's not creepy or paranormal, but it is so far beyond our experience that, if you look at the science fiction film starting in the 50s, and not just film, fiction as well, has this like proliferation of homicidal plants. And I actually have a piece about that, and I talk about it as this anxiety about the human, and what it really is the human begin, because this is the same period in which Darwin is getting brought to the fore again through the evolutionary synthesis, and there's this whole sense of like, we're not the telos. If we take evolution seriously, something should come after us, right? We're either going to go extinct or evolve into something really different. And there's a kind of apocalyptic feeling about that. And I take the homicidal plants as an emblem of the terror of nature in some way.
Well,
but it's plants, not animals.
Yeah. Well, the other, of course, implicit theme there is plants that interact with human neurology in kind of psychedelic ways. And
oh yeah.
I mean, the relationship between human beings and plants is ancient, and the role that plants have played in the formation of religious belief and mythology. I mean, you could make the argument that human myth and religion are actually the plants speaking through us or speaking with us.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
But I think regardless, I do think that there is something profoundly uncanny about plants, and you can trace it. Again, animals, I'm not saying, I don't want to put one against the other, but there is something really uncanny about plants. Again, like we have pets, right? And we talk to our pets, and we've already incorporated them in that way into our lives. But plants, we might have plants, and we might even talk to plants. If they start interacting with us in the way animals do, that's a very different thing.
Well, we eat plants too, and they become us.
Totally. And they maintain us. They are our life source.
And then, of course,
really
we become the plants when we die. I mean,
I like thinking of it that way.
So listen, you mentioned the ecology of the paranormal and environmental studies. I mean, obviously that's where we're going here. Can you say more about that, and why the paranormal should be at the center of environmental thinking?
Again, well, and I've also gotten off Rhine. So if you want me to go back to Rhine, I'm happy to do that. But
there is no online. There is no.
Well, and I do want to make one other point that I've noticed about why some place like North Carolina, and I remember being here the first time I was here in the summer, and I'm from the north, and the insect life and the plant life and the humidity, it makes you almost high. It is otherworldly when it gets really hot and steamy and humid here. And I began to understand where, oh God, now I've blanked on the name, magical realism came from, right? It's hypnotic. And so I really do wonder if there is something biotic going on in that way. But why environmental science? I mean, I have a lot of reasons for that, but the simplest and most obvious is that we really need to be thinking in a radically different way if we're going to have any hope of inhabiting the planet differently. And I think as we've been talking about, so first of all, the one thing that the paranormal does that is very important is it disorients. Yeah. It unsettles our thinking.
Yeah.
And we need that unsettling for all of our knowledge. I mean, that's what draws me so much. I love having my thinking unsettled. I love being mystified. The experience, that experience. And so I think on the one hand, to study the environment and to begin to address these issues, that's imperative. But then the flip side is what we've been talking about, that there is something uncanny because of how we have classified that world and how it defies it. And we see all the time, like these classifications. It's not just the plant world, insect life, microbial life. These things are constantly, when viruses were first identified in the 50s, in the 30s with, the more sophisticated technology, but they really in the 50s, when people get serious about studying viruses, the thing they're astonished by is that it defies our definition of life.
Yeah.
It doesn't reproduce the way we think living things are, and it doesn't metabolize the way living things are supposed to. It lies dormant until it has food. I mean, all of these characteristics. And what do they say constantly in the mainstream media when they're talking about this? The twilight zone between the living and the dying. That's the virus. And what does it do? It gets into a human being and gets into the nuclei of our cells, takes them over, and changes the information that our cells are delivering. Well, that's medical science. But how is that not invasion of the body snatchers? Which in fact echoes a lot of the medical science when it talks about the way that the pod people are working. And of course, what are they? Pod people. They're vegetables. Of course they're vegetables. The thing from another world is a vegetable from a planet. One of the journalists in the film calls it an intellectual carrot, which is one of my favorite lines in all of film. And what is it? It's come from another planet where clearly evolution has been botanical rather than animal, right? It's been vegetative rather than animal, and it's smarter than we are, right? Even though it looks like Frankenstein, whatever. Whatever. Could have been different, but it isn't. And it feeds on human beings. And what does it do? It has no more regard for us than we would have for a field of cabbage. Another one of my favorite quotes from the film. What is it that's getting worked out there? Tremendous anxiety about what the human is and our need to be somehow outside nature when we're not, which is also what genomics was telling us, right?
Yeah. Amitav Ghosh was here at Rice last fall, and this is essentially what he talked about. He talked about the need to think about a kind of vitalist metaphysics and what he called non-human agents, which is really what you're talking about here.
As a real other, as a genuine other, right?
Yeah.
We don't know. So again, the temptation is to anthropomorphize and attribute our feelings on the one hand, and on the other to say it's utterly other than the human. But the truth is we haven't figured out that communication yet, and we have no idea, right? People talking to dolphins are discovering, we thought we were the only creatures that had the ability for abstract thinking. Well, and being able to name absent things or talk about time, past, and future. People starting to communicate with dolphins fully believe and have lots of scientific evidence that the dolphins are capable of abstract thinking. Well, why wouldn't they be? Why would we be the only ones who evolved that particular thing? Yeah, we have things that just we seem able to do. But again, what do we really know about these other things?
No, I'm totally with you, of course. And, it explains why you're so interested in the paranormal, because of course it kind of pushes beyond the human in a big way. So can you say more about science fiction and why it's an important genre here, and why you're interested in it, and what you mean by myth history, and what you think's happening in terms of this new story forming? That's a lot. That's a lot of questions. I'm sorry. Let's go back. How about just science fiction? We'll just
science fiction. Okay. So for the reasons we've been talking about, because these are the topics of science fiction, and science fiction, which has been around for a long time, even prior to its name, and it gets named in the late 1920s. But science fiction, the mass media, genre, really takes hold in the 1950s as all of these questions that I'm really interested in are emerging. And the questions that I'm interested in, on the one hand, we've just had this talk about trauma, collective trauma. Of course, this genre is going to emerge of World War II, of two world wars, really, but of World War II and the massive techno destruction, genocide of various kinds. Raphael Lemkin calling attention to how genocide has been endemic to colonialism, is rooted in colonialism. So it's been around for a long time. And, beginning to be aware of that and saying, so what are we as a species? And are we about to destroy ourselves? Meantime, so these questions coming out of the UN efforts to imagine human rights, to imagine a way to sacralize the human in a secular world, such that, I'm thinking of Emile Durkheim here, who says the religion of the human is humanity, right? And we are the worshipers and the gods at the same time. And what does that mean? How do we imagine something that will make the human inviolable, that will make genocide truly unimaginable enough for people to recognize it and address it? And not just genocide, but all other kinds of massive crimes. And so that's happening at the same time that the science, the evolutionary synthesis, is emerging and telling us that we're part of nature. That whole thing of humans being outside or above or whatever. No, we're thick in it, and we will go extinct or evolve, which I suppose a lot of people think is another form of extinction. And so these two things together really produce what I am taking from historians, William McNeill, most notably. Joseph Mali is another, but William McNeill is really the guy whose work I'm interested in, who's a historian and says all history has mythic elements, by which he means history is where a community's values and beliefs reside and are experienced as truths and become, again, kind of sacred. And at moments of crisis, they surface and the story begins to change and then settles in again. Well, I'm taking very seriously that word myth, not meaning untruth and not just meaning ideology, but also the anthropological understanding of myth, meaning the sacred stories that we live by, the things that allow us not only to communicate and not only to have a kind of collective ideology, but also that make us feel more transcendent. And we need that. We absolutely need that. But it also has a danger. And the danger is palpable in, pre-Nazi Germany. That's what Hitler did, right? And Raphael Lemkin, guy who coins genocide, Polish Jew who fled the Nazis, is looking at Hitler and saying, that's what he did. We need to do it, but with a story that is positive, not positive, that is, I don't even have the word, that is not going to lead to genocide, but lead in the other direction.
Yeah.
The word I would use is inclusive, socially just, etc.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit. I mean, of course, this is the definition of myth I was trained in the history of religion school at the university. That's exactly what we meant. We meant a story so basic that people don't even know they're living inside it.
Right.
I mean, they don't even think it's a story. They think it's the way the world really is, and like, exactly. No, it's mythic. You're in a myth. You're in a story, and you don't know it.
So I'll bring that back now to the paranormal, why I study the paranormal and science fiction. First of all, science fiction is either futuristic, usually futuristic, or alternative history. And either way, it's about history, right? If it's futuristic, we the reader are reminded that we are making history. And I think if it's alternative history, same thing. So it's this making us aware of the agency of how we produce the world and the stories about it. And the reason I think the paranormal is so interesting there is one of the things Molly says is there's always an us them. And us them is exactly what Hitler did to an nth degree. And all nations, groups, any group does it to some extent. So for me, and I'm following Octavia Butler here, I'm following Sylvia Wynter here. Those are my go-tos, Aimé Césaire. For me, what is so important is making is becoming aware of those stories that we're living and the world we're creating, and consciously trying to make them more inclusive, ever more just. It's a utopian ideal, but why not go for it? And what does the paranormal do? It's the thing where the story isn't working. It's the thing where you get to that impasse, and you're like, okay, I'm now seeing through the fabric, right? Now I'm puncturing that thing, and I'm seeing how I'm seeing more of what we're not seeing. And that is my goal as an educator, is to see what we're not seeing.
So, you're singing my tune, Priscilla.
I know. That's why we're friends.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me so much about extreme experiencers is they'll often say, it was as if I were in a movie, or it was as if I were in a novel. And my reply is, well, you are.
All the time.
All the time. And so the paranormal for me is precisely that waking up to the recognition that you are in a story. And that story does not serve a lot of people. It actually hurts a lot of people. Well, I don't care what your story is. And so that's what that's what I hear you saying.
That's 100% what I'm saying. And take what has emerged during the pandemic is we have made more visible to a larger group of people, right, who hadn't been seeing it, structural racism.
Yep.
And structural racism, I mean, the pandemic, I've studied it for a long time. It was not news to me that there were, certain populations totally corresponding to the ones receiving the most racist treatment in the US and elsewhere, right? So different populations in different places, because race and racism manifest differently. But that was should not have been a surprise to anyone. It's been visible forever, but it became more apparent to a broader public. Yeah. And that was what the Black Lives Matter protests were about. And I just was reading today about how traffic deaths have skyrocketed during COVID. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. Fewer people on the road meant people were driving more carelessly and got used to it. Now people are back on the road, et cetera. People are angrier, more disoriented, all kinds of things. I went through a red light the other day completely. Fortunately, it was 6 a.m. and, no one else on the road, just disorientation, right? But of course, which populations are getting hit hardest? Black and Indigenous, of course. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. More likely to be pedestrians, maybe smaller cars, all kinds of reasons that were given in this article. But structural racism is palpable in this country. And the first thing we need to be addressing, everything else follows from it, and including climate change, everything. And that was the Black Lives Matter argument. That is the Black Lives Matter argument. How do we get there? We have to make the story visible.
That's also waking up and realizing you're in this really bad story. It's
really bad.
It's really, really bad.
The myth history that needs to get rewritten urgently now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this is why I think that, so I think one of the knee-jerk academic now responses to the paranormal is it has nothing to do with social justice. And I just disagree. I just think that's wrong. And I think you've articulated very well why it's wrong. It's such a powerful argument. I just want to honor your argument. I just think it's right. So
I do too, obviously, but
that's why.
But I also want someone to tell me if I'm wrong, because again, same thing. It's also another way to go.
This is a related, not directly related comment, but years ago I taught a 30-day workshop on sexuality and religion, and it was the same premise actually, and it was that if you grew up religious, you grew up inside a story, and chances are that story, you came in conflict with that story at one point. Usually around, at that point in the culture, it was gender and sexuality. And I made the mistake of starting the 30-day workshop by going around the room and asking people to tell stories. It took a week and a half. And I mean, people were bawling and crying. And I think in that group, there were probably 30 people in there. I think there was one person who had a positive experience of the culture that he or she happened to be born into. Everybody else was, no, they hit a wall, the story ceased to work, and then it didn't work anymore. And then they're caught, they're caught in this moment that you're describing so well.
Which is the reaction we're seeing,
Uh-huh.
with white supremacy. I mean, white supremacy is about a lot of things.
Yeah.
But one of them is people don't want to change their story. They don't want to, this is the banning books that's happening now that is so shocking. And you're in Texas, you're right there. Sure, it'll come to North Carolina if it's not here already. But the the not wanting to see is like, if you're ontologically invested in your story, you don't want to see what you're complicit in. And it's painful. What do you do with that information? And I just wish that as educators, that's something we could work on, is like, how do we bring people to this understanding in a way that allows them to accept it without being so reactive? And again, I'm being utopian, but
well, how do we? I mean, that's a really, because I do, by the way, work and teach in Texas. Thank you for recognizing that. It is different, frankly, than working and teaching in the Northeast, which I've also done, and or in California, which I've also
we're
done.
in Durham, North Carolina, to be fair. I mean,
yeah.
Progressive politics in my particular city. We have great governance in this city, the best I've ever experienced.
So how do you do that though, as an intellectual? I mean, how do you think about it, Priscilla? I mean, obviously you've thought about it a lot. And how do you work with young people in the classroom? And how do you talk to people who aren't there, I guess, is what I really want to know. How do we talk to our publics, I guess, is the question.
I think, I wish I had a good answer, because I don't think I've done it particularly well. And I try to follow other people. But I mean, I think the first thing I learned as a teacher is the most important thing about teaching is listening. Mm-hmm. Right? And how do you meet someone where they are? How do you hear anger and recognize fear, for instance? Mm-hmm. I've had that experience a lot in a classroom, where a student will get really angry about something we're doing, and it's clear something has made them feel that they're not smart, or that they're not getting it. Mm-hmm. And or that they're not being, well, let's start there, and recognizing that that's the problem, rather than that they hate something. And as a teacher, that's a beginning. And I guess, I try to hear what it is that people are really saying. I mean, I heard a podcast the other day with a woman who was rabidly wanting some book not to be taught, an interview with her, not to be taught in the school. And what I was hearing was this thing that people are saying, oh, you're teaching my children, to hate America, that's one, or you're teaching my children that all white people are bad, and the interviewer was so good. And she said, but isn't all literature, students will identify with the protagonist of the story, and the story, it was the author who was saying it. I wish I could remember, it wasn't the interviewer. I wish I could remember the name of this author. It was one of the blue boy. No. And I want to read the book. So, I'm sorry, I can't remember it. I feel bad. But the author of it was, and it was based on his experience being one of the few Black students in a New York school. I think the school was Fieldston. I'm not sure. I don't want to. And he was saying, how do you not? There it is. Thank you. Oh, I can't see it. All right. All boys are blue. Is that it? All boys are blue?
All boys aren't blue.
Aren't blue. Okay. Thank you. Oh, whatever. All right. So that's first thing, is learn what you're actually, talking about. But the author was so smart about saying, people identify, or not, whoever said it, people identify with the protagonist. You get in the head of the protagonist. That's one of the beauties of literature. Mm-hmm. And that is, to me, the first moment where often people begin to relativize that story they were raised in, to begin to realize that, oh, people really do see the world in radically different ways from how I see it. You read literature and you see through the eyes of a protagonist.
Well, that's, when you study comparative religion, that's lesson number one, that people live in a different story. And that's what we call myth. And not only do they live in the story, they reenact it over and over again. That's what we call ritual. And by reenacting that story over and over, sometimes every day, you strengthen the story.
And you do. And then, as you said earlier, that story is reality, mm-hmm. right? And so what the interviewer and the author, what their conversation was about was, the kids are going to identify with the protagonist. They're not going to feel that they're, somehow being made evil or whatever. And the protagonist and the story doesn't do that. I mean, that's the other thing about this particular story. But the point is, what this woman did not understand, she didn't understand something profound about literature and what happens in a classroom. And she didn't understand that recognizing that you have been living in this bad story does not make you a heinous person. Oh. Your children are not being asked to feel guilty. They're being asked to recognize that they are living in and perpetuating this story, and that they need to help change the story in a very positive, productive way, and make everyone's lives better in the process.
Well,
and if you can help, maybe get her at what she's afraid of.
Yeah.
Can you bring one or two people along? You're not going to get everybody, but it's a start. Right?
I can also assure you, being a censored author, that people who want to censor or ban books don't read them.
Yeah.
I mean, they think they know what's in them or what they're about, but they never actually read them.
Toni Morrison, of all things, really? Are one of the finest writers of the century, of the previous century. Like, really? Mouse?
You don't read the book. Yeah, just don't read it. Just tell people what it's about, and it's something bad.
Yeah. And also, and then that's the other thing, is like, who are we trying to protect when we don't read about the negative things that people have experienced, the negative things of our history? How is that? How are we not going to make a better world if we don't know where we've gone wrong? It's like, if somebody writes an essay and I don't tell them, if I don't tell them what isn't working in that essay, how are they going to improve as writers? It's the same thing. We're writing this story. How are we, if we don't see where bad things, awful things happened, how are we going to prevent them?
Well, that's, the reason it's called the Archives of the, it's named after authors of the impossible. And that's the whole principle, is that we have to wake up that we're actually authoring our own realities. Right. And what the paranormal is when reality breaks through those stories and says, hey, guess what? The story you're living in isn't reality. Right. And that is scary.
Terrifying.
It's terrifying.
Utterly disorienting. And you can welcome the disorientation, or you can do your best to shut it out.
yeah, I mean, it's also delicious. I mean, I think this is what an intellectual is. I think this is what you were trying to articulate earlier. I personally love when my story is busted,
Me too.
you know, but why? Well, I mean,
Well,
to me, that's a mystery. Why is it delicious and inviting for some people, and it's terrifying and blasphemous to others?
well,
I
why does somebody want to fly to the moon and someone else doesn't, right? I mean, like, so I talk about this a lot when I teach generally, but, especially science fiction, but generally, that I have always wanted I watch The Matrix and you see this dystopic world and no one wants to live in that world. And I think, oh my God, how cool to discover that gravity isn't real.
yeah.
Like run up walls and do
But he
these.
flies away. He flies away at the end of the
Oh
movie.
my God. I look at that and I'm like, that is so cool. And I think to myself, God, I would love to find out. I would love to be alive when something that we all just assume was true, you discover isn't. Like people come from another planet and inform you about what's going on out in the galaxy, somewhere else in the cosmos, whatever. And then I realized, wait a minute, that's what I do every single day when I'm working.
Yeah.
I mean, on a very small scale, right? It's not like gravity, but I'm always discovering that something I believed is different from what I thought. And it's exhilarating.
And the weird thing, Priscilla, and this is where it gets uncanny, is when you realize that's what you're doing, more of that stuff happens.
Yeah.
I mean, it has a kind of conjuring or I'll just tell you a funny story, and then we have to go to Q&A because we only have 13 minutes left.
Oh
But
my God.
I gotta tell you my Matrix story. Have I told you my Matrix story?
Oh.
Okay, this is a real Matrix story. So I was actually at a conference. It was in Big Sur. It was at Esalen, and Jacques Vallée was talking, the ufologist and the computer scientist, and he was talking about the Matrix. Red pill this, blue pill this, everything's digital, everything's a computer simulation. He went on and on for like an hour and a half about the Matrix. So we break for lunch and we walk up to the lodge, and I swear to God, there is Lawrence Fishburne. And people just were freaking out. They were just like freaking out. But it was like, oh, that is so good.
They conjured him, right?
Yeah, we conjured Lawrence Fish. We conjured Morpheus. And it really happened. I'm not
And
joking.
the guy giving that talk didn't know he was there.
No, of course not. None of us knew.
I love it.
Yeah. Okay, let's open it up for Q&A, but maybe somebody doesn't. Maybe somebody has a question.
I mean, if not, I can also answer your why some people are so exhilarated by it.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Answer that. That'd be great.
I mean, to me, I think it has to do maybe with how attached you are to your identity. And I've never been that attached to any particular aspect of mine that I'm sure I am in ways I'm not aware, but I've not been someone who's wanted to do an ancestry search or, I'm much more interested in what's ahead.
Yeah.
And I find it tremendously creative to be confronted with the weird, the marvelous, not the traumatic. I'm not looking for trauma. I don't want that part of that experience, but and I guess that there are people for whom that is unsettling. I mean, maybe I don't have really strong boundaries in good or bad ways. Every good thing is also a bad thing, right? And so for me, the excitement of discovery is far more interesting than whatever security is. Maybe I've just never really had a lot of security. I don't know.
So, yeah, or maybe,
what do you think?
Maybe you've transcended your ego and you're an enlightened being or something.
I don't think it's necessarily a good thing.
Okay, let me channel. There's two questions here.
Go ahead.
And let me channel them both because I think they hit different points. The first one is really gets at this question about why people are scared. I mean, it's really a question about, but what about scary paranormal phenomena? I mean, what about demonic possession? What he asked about Skinwalker Ranch. This is Jefferson Lee. I mean, it's a haunted ranch in Utah, and really scary stuff happens. I mean, it's not all peace and light and love. So that's the first question. And then Michael Bryant asked the question, which, by the way, my mentor, Wendy Doniger, wrote a whole book about. He says, if we're in a story, who is the author? I'm really intrigued.
Easier for me than the other.
Yeah, he says, are we the authors, as humanists like to think, or is something else writing us, determining our actions?
Interesting. There's a wonderful Asimov story. Comes there a man, breeds there a man, breeds there a man. All about that like we're little microbes in somebody's experiment. I mean, to me, we are writing that story, which is probably also my answer to the first question for me, myself. I haven't had that kind of experience, and I'm not sure that I believe it. That's not what I think of as the paranormal. I could have an experience, do I want that kind of experience to probably not. Although if I survived it, it would be kind of fascinating.
Well, I mean, if I can answer the first question, Jefferson, I mean, people do have profoundly negative paranormal experiences, but what I'm always reminded of is it's people having negative paranormal experiences. In other words, my gut feeling is yours, Priscilla, that ultimately this is all human. I mean, the uncanny and the haunted and the ghost, and it's an aspect not of us, not of Jeff and Priscilla, but of something deeper that is being experienced. And I think that's the kind of superhumanist answer. It's not humanism in the old materialist sense, but it's a kind of new humanism that understands the humanism in a much broader, much more cosmic sense.
I think it's Durkheim. That the transcendence is humanity collectively. He has a brilliant essay, intellectuals and individualism and the intellectuals, I think is what it's called. Anyway, those are the keywords. And it's a brilliant essay about humanity as the source of these experiences, humanity to core. And we are writing our reality collectively.
And so just again, to channel some more, we're getting lots of nice questions. This one's from Christine Skolnick. She basically, she thinks of paranormal events as consciousness being broken, like a hammer. And she asked the question, what is the purpose behind these breakthroughs? Like, okay, if these are realizations were the story, where are they going? What's the telos, if there is one?
A telos to these stories?
I know. What is the purpose behind breaking through one story and having a paranormal experience?
Well, for me, again, it's that question of being able to see the story. How do you see the story you're writing? Because by definition, we don't see the story we're writing. So what is it? And it is often trauma. I mean, this is why structural racism is so important, because if you are living the negative, the worst of the reality of structural racism, if you're Black in the US, for instance, or Indigenous in the US or whatever, you are more likely, Du Bois, this is double consciousness, you're more likely to see through the story.
Okay, that's the answer. Yeah, that's the answer actually to some of these other questions. I mean, you don't believe the story for one thing, that the kind of cultural story, and because you see right through it, because
if you're not privileged within the story, you're more likely to recognize it. And I am one of the privileged, And so the paranormal in some contexts, in other contexts not, but in most contexts in the US. And if, I mean, this helps me see what I'm not seeing. And that is fundamental to social justice. You've got to be able to see what you're not seeing. And you've got to be able to take ownership of it and consequences of that vision. And I guess that's a better answer to why I personally am so drawn to this, is that I desperately want to see through this story. I don't like this story. I like things about this story. You can't throw out the whole thing, right? It's
Well, you got to tell another story. I mean, I think that's
got to tell another story. And this is, again, Sylvia Wynter, Octavia Butler. You know, everyone should read the Xenogenesis trilogy, because Octavia, I mean, that is the most theoretically brilliant. Butler and Wynter together.
Maybe Tim can put that in the chat. What's the essay or the
Octavia Butler, the trilogy, the Xenogenesis trilogy, Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago.
Okay.
And also just Sylvia Wynter's work generally. And I think they're very much Sylvia Wynter as a critic, a cultural critic, Octavia Butler as a science fiction writer, speculative fiction writer. I think the two of them are getting at really the same things.
Okay.
The myths that govern us, the myth histories, and how we can't throw them out. We tell a new story. We rewrite that story. We get at what's wrong with the story, and we just keep retelling it. There is no telos. We keep retelling it and trying to make it better.
Well, it's wanting to live in another story. And of course, that story will fail us as well. So we're going to tell another one. Right.
Yes. It's an endless process. That's ultimately how I read the Xenogenesis trilogy.
Yeah, it's a never-ending story.
Constant rewriting.
Listen, Priscilla, that is a fantastic place to stop. That we never end. We just tell more stories. We tell better stories, and we abandon or move beyond the stories we're born into or caught in, which is how I hear you. So let's end there. Let's thank you. Let's thank our many listeners, and let's look forward to March, so we can do this thing. Tell a different story. Yeah. Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you, Joe.
Everyone.
Thank you, Joe, somewhere behind the screen.
Thanks everyone for the questions and participating.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.